So remember, in the third week of Lent, or Sunday of Lent, that we get a little more diversity than the normal first 2 weeks, Sundays of Lent, as far as the themes year to year. The first 2 weeks, we always hear a version, the first Sunday of Lent on Jesus' temptation in the desert, the second Sunday of Lent on the Transfiguration. So those themes are always reinforced by the gospel on one of the Matthew, Mark, or Luke's version. The third Sunday, we start seeing that diversity, partially because it's the first scrutiny for the catechumens preparing for baptism. So they hear 3 readings in Gospels every year that are from John's Gospel. The Samaritan woman, they had heard that at the 9 o'clock Mass today. Next weekend, they'll hear the man born blind in John's Gospel. And then the 5th Sunday of Lent every year, the catechumens hear the Gospel of Lazarus being raised from the dead. But then the rest of us, if we're not at one of those Masses, typically go through the rotation. So the cleansing of the temple, we hear this in year B, in the 3rd Sunday every year. And one of the things to remember is that there's different theories about when this took place. The Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call the Synoptic Gospels, remember, because they're similar. They all have this moment happening during Holy Week. And that's kind of the most traditional version. A lot of the stories, or if you've seen kind of the daily reflections on Holy Week, Monday of Holy Week, usually the focus is Jesus after the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, going to the temple for this moment of cleansing. In John's Gospel, though, he has Jesus going to Passover in Jerusalem every year of his public ministry, so for 3 years. So the version we heard today is happening that first year that he goes to the temple. But all that being said, there's still several lessons we can learn from this moment. And the one thing that certainly struck me, and it does every time, is the quote that the apostles and his followers think of when they see Jesus with his passion. And their quote from the prophets, that was a messianic quote that they would have known, that it says, "Zeal for his house will consume him." And they thought of this applying to him in this moment, this idea of zeal. And so there's a couple lessons we can learn from it. One, this is always a moment to remember kind of that difference between justified anger and unjustified anger. And Jesus shows us the model of using anger and channeling it towards standing up for something that's right and good, and having the courage to do that. But there would be a sense that there was an intentionality with Jesus, that this wasn't an emotional response that he just got caught up in, but this had been thought through. That's how we can use that anger that can come from us when we see wrong and injustice, to respond in courage, to seek the truth and what's right and good. But we have to be careful that we don't allow the anger to order us, right? To have more of that emotional response where we're not in control, we're not being intentional. And certainly another key to the justified anger is looking at our motives. Is this done out of charity, of truly wanting the good for the other, or is it motivated by judgment or condemnation and just wanting to take down the other? And obviously, in this moment, Jesus is motivated by love, truly wanting what's best, seeing, part of this is a statement against the improper use of the temple, improper use of religion. That even though they had to have some level of the animal sacrifices and the people having those animals being available to them, that there were abuses taking place. And so addressing that, wanting pure religion, the pure temple, and not using it for personal gain or for wealth or whatever the other reasons that can slip in there. So that justified anger that Jesus has, to stand up for that. So those are important when we're seeking our anger, to channel it, to make sure it's motivated in love, not in judgment, to make sure that we are intentionally ordering our actions in that love and not being ordered by anger or emotion that we're not in control of. So good lesson to learn. But I think we could take this to another level, though. And Pope Benedict XVI, he actually wrote 3 great books on Jesus of Nazareth. They're commentaries on the Gospels. They're really one of the, I think, the great legacies that he left us as Pope. And this one I'm holding is the one on Holy Week. He did one on the infancy narratives, one on the 3-year public ministry of Jesus, and then one for Holy Week, which is this one. And he actually places the cleansing in Holy Week, so he's reinforcing that traditional view of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in there, he addresses this idea that there was a trend in the 60s and 50s to kind of suggest that maybe Jesus was more of he was in rebellion against the oppression of the Romans, and kind of the zealousness, the zeal that was recognized by the apostles was more in the line of the zealots that were a part of that time, that were seeking to address this oppression through violence. And was this possibly a, kind of Jesus joining in that, but then he got caught and got killed, and that was the end of that. So Pope Benedict, he has this to say about that. He talks about this moment of the zeal that Jesus has for God's house. This is a fundamental transformation that Jesus brought to the theme of zeal. The zeal that would serve God through violence, he transformed into the zeal of the cross. So the cross, that's a key interpretive piece to understanding Jesus, obviously. And remember, St. Paul addressed that in his second reading we heard today. Remember, he talked about this idea that the cross is a stumbling block for Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. So how do we understand this interpretive key to Jesus' zeal? And so he goes on to say, thus he definitively established the criterion for true zeal, the zeal of self-giving love. That's ultimately, again, that motive that can come from that zeal, or maybe those moments of justified anger. But what does he call it? The self-giving love. Sometimes we call it sacrificial love of the cross. That's the interpretive key that kind of Jesus gives to this idea of zeal. So ultimately, the zeal for souls, the zeal for salvation for the other, the ultimate good, wanting what's best for them. And so that challenge we have during Lent to let God renew in us the zeal for others, their good, their salvation ultimately, and that being our motive. Even if at moments we use that justified anger to seek the truth for them and the good for them. So 2 great examples we had this week that I ran into for that passion for souls, and particularly those who might be marginalized or who at times people saw a need to minister to and a neglect of. One of them was St. Catherine Drexel. Her feast was March 3rd, this past Tuesday, I believe. Was that Tuesday? I keep forgetting that. But, or is that? Yes, I think so. No, Thursday, right? Anyway, whatever day that was, St. Catherine Drexel, remember, she was from Philadelphia. So the second American-born saint in our country, our own Pennsylvanian, an heiress of millions of dollars, was known to give over $10 million away of her inheritance to establish over 45 institutions to help those, to bring the light of Christ to those in the margins. And particularly, she had a great heart for starting schools and outreach and ministry to Black Americans and Native Americans. And that was a huge part of her legacy. And so she had a great zeal for those souls, lived 97 years, died in 1955, a great example we just had this past week. The other one, a little closer to home, if anybody gets the Magnificat, and again, I can't encourage enough for you to consider getting a daily devotional, something that helps give you some source of prayer and reflection and even spiritual reading on a daily basis. We give out the Word Among Us. There are other versions of it. But this past Friday, they have a section Usually they have one called Saint Who, where they'll cover some more obscure saints that we haven't heard of. But then they have a section they call Credible Witness that they have on some days. And so on March 5th, this past week, the name of the credible witness they identified is Servant of God, Gertrude Barber. So our own Erie native. And so remember, her cause was opened by Bishop Persico back in 2019. There's a great article written by a woman called Heather King in there, and reminds us of this great zeal for souls that Gertrude had, particularly those who, children who were dealing with disabilities, physical or intellectual disabilities. She was a pioneer, as we know, in that legacy of the Barber Center, to continuing to serve the needs of children and adults that deal with intellectual or physical disabilities. And so really remarkable. And so I was really struck by the fact, one, that before she started that kind of focus in her life, it talks about, actually it's on the website for her cause for canonization, but it talks about how an Erie superintendent, an assistant superintendent, back when she was younger, talked to her. She had this desire, this zeal to be a missionary. And the superintendent said to her, "You don't have to leave the country to be a missionary." And that really got her to decide to stay in Erie and focus on making a change here, right in Erie. And we know she did. Again, because of her work, there was a quote in this article from Magnificat from Monsignor Goodall, the founding pastor, a beloved priest of our history of our diocese, the founding pastor of St. Luke's. And he had this to say about her: "Dr. Barber was the Mother Teresa of Erie. She saw the suffering of the exceptional children and adults of this area and used her manifest skills and, above all, her love to respond." Another example of that zeal for souls, the zeal for good of another, especially those who might be being neglected or overlooked in seeking their good. And so these are great examples, hopefully, to inspire us to continue to ask God to help us to have a greater zeal for each other, for the good of others, for in love and sacrificial love of the cross, in our zeal for God's house, to have that zeal for our brothers and sisters in our human family, and especially those who are neglected. And so something to pray with and to think about. The other part about Gertrude Barber was she's the first lay person to be, for her cause for canonization, to be opened in Pennsylvania. So again, she makes an example to all of us and to all of you, the lay people, that all of us are called to that same zeal. So let's allow Jesus' zeal, the zeal of St. Catherine, of Servant of God, Gertrude Barber, to inspire us to show our zeal for God's house, for the people of God, for our brothers and sisters in our human family, and to show it by living out for them that love, that sacrificial love, that self-giving love of the cross this Lent.